He was the voice that made millions laugh, the face audiences trusted, and the talent everyone admired. But behind the perfect Hollywood image lay a marriage unraveling in silence and rage. What followed inside their home was so shocking, it forever shattered comedy's brightest light. The story of Phil Hartman begins long before the tragic headlines that shook Hollywood in 1998. To understand the weight of what was lost, one must return to the very roots of his journey. A journey that, from its earliest steps, was defined by a blend of artistry, intelligence, and a quiet determination that made him unlike anyone else in the industry. Born Philip Edward Hartman in Brantford, Ontario, in 1948, he was the fourth of 8 children in a large Catholic family. The Hartmans immigrated to the United States when Phil was still young, settling first in Maine and later in California. From an early age, Phil's personality seemed to shine through in subtle yet unforgettable ways. While not the loudest or most attention-seeking of the siblings, he displayed a creative spark that would eventually become his defining gift. Growing up in the 1950s and 1960s in Southern California gave Phil a front-row seat to the cultural explosion of American life. Music, art, television, and film were reshaping the world, and he absorbed it all. He studied art at California State University, Northridge, honing his skills in graphic design. Long before the world knew him as a performer, Phil had a steady hand as a visual artist. In fact, he designed album covers for bands like Poco and Crosby, Stills, and Nash. But while his art was admired, it was his charisma in social settings that hinted at something greater. Friends recalled that in casual gatherings he could mimic anyone, slipping into characters with uncanny precision, often leaving those around him in stitches. At first, it was just a party trick. No one could have predicted that this ability would become the cornerstone of his legacy. It wasn't until his late 20s that Hartman began to seriously pursue performing. In 1975, almost by chance, he stumbled into the Groundlings, a Los Angeles-based improvisational and sketch comedy troupe. For Phil, the experience was transformative. While many comedians clawed their way for attention with loud personalities, Hartman took a different approach. He was the one who would listen, study the room, and then quietly unleash something so sharp, so unexpected, that it often stole the show. His natural instincts allowed him to embody a wide range of characters, from authoritative figures to eccentric oddballs, always with a precision that felt effortless. Fellow performers at the Groundlings quickly recognized his genius. He had the rare ability to disappear into a role, so much so that audiences would forget the man behind the performance. His fellow Groundlings alumni, including Paul Reubens, remember him as a pillar of the troupe. In fact, one of Hartman's first major breaks came through his collaboration with Reubens. Phil co-created and co-wrote The Pee Wee Herman Show, a stage production that later became the hit children's show Pee-wee's Playhouse. Not only did he shape the show behind the scenes, but he also played the memorable character Captain Carl on screen. This early success opened doors that would eventually lead him to Saturday Night Live. By the mid-1980s, Saturday Night Live was searching for fresh talent to revive its reputation after years of decline. In 1986, Hartman joined the cast, and almost immediately, he became a stabilizing force on the show. His range was astonishing. One week he could play a bumbling character, the next he could impersonate Ronald Reagan or Bill Clinton with such uncanny accuracy that even political insiders were impressed. His portrayal of Clinton, in particular, became iconic, cementing his reputation as one of the sharpest impressionists in comedy. Castmates often referred to him as the glue of SNL, someone who could elevate any sketch, hold it together, and make it work. Offstage, however, Hartman was markedly different. Unlike many comedians who thrived on attention, he was quiet, even reserved. He described himself as an introvert, someone who preferred solitude and routine when not performing. This contrast between the larger-than-life characters he played and the calm, private man he was in reality fascinated those around him. He didn't chase the spotlight off camera, nor did he seek out fame in the ways many of his peers did. Instead, he seemed content to let his work speak for itself. During his years at SNL, Hartman's reputation grew not just among fans but also within the industry. He was respected as a professional, someone who came prepared, never faltered under pressure, and consistently delivered. His peers often said he was the kind of actor you wanted in a sketch because you knew he would make it better. Unlike many stars who used the platform of SNL as a launching pad for movie careers, Hartman appeared comfortable staying in television, carving out a niche where his versatility could shine. When he left SNL in 1994 after 8 seasons, he transitioned seamlessly into other roles. He joined the cast of News Radio, an NBC sitcom about the eccentric staff of a New York news radio station. As Bill McNeil, the arrogant yet hilariously self-absorbed news anchor, Hartman once again proved his ability to transform into characters that audiences both loved and laughed at. He played McNeil with a balance of satire and depth, making him one of the most memorable figures on the show. At the same time, he continued his work on The Simpsons, lending his voice to Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, two characters that remain fan favorites to this day. By the mid-1990s, Phil Hartman had achieved what many in comedy could only dream of. He was admired by peers, beloved by audiences, and regarded as one of the most versatile comedic talents of his generation. But behind the professional accolades, his personal life was far more complicated. His third marriage to Bryn Omdahl, a former model and aspiring actress, appeared to outsiders as glamorous. They lived in a beautiful Encino home, raised 2 children together, and moved in celebrity circles. Yet cracks in the marriage were apparent to those who knew them closely. Bryn struggled with the shadow cast by Phil's success. She had once hoped for a career of her own in Hollywood, but found it difficult to break through. Friends noted that she often felt diminished, as though she existed only as Phil Hartman's wife. Those insecurities, compounded by struggles with substance abuse, created volatility in the relationship. Where Phil often withdrew in the face of conflict, Bryn's frustrations sometimes manifested in anger and confrontation. Their marriage was a cycle of calm and storm, love and resentment. This dynamic was not always visible to the public, who saw only the smiling family on red carpets or the charming anecdotes shared in interviews. But to those within their circle, the tension was undeniable. Friends recalled times when Bryn's jealousy would flare, particularly around other women. Phil's laid-back, almost passive approach to conflict sometimes allowed issues to fester unresolved. Those who knew them well worried about the imbalance in their relationship. By the late 1990s, Hartman had begun to talk quietly to friends about feeling trapped between his devotion to his children and the challenges of his marriage. He loved being a father, and his children brought him immense joy. But maintaining stability at home while navigating Bryn's insecurities was becoming increasingly difficult. Despite the growing turbulence in his private life, Phil remained outwardly composed and professionally reliable. He continued to show up on set, deliver flawless performances, and maintain the image of a man at the peak of his career. For audiences, there was no hint of the storm brewing behind closed doors. It was this contrast, the comedic brilliance on screen, the quiet struggles off screen, that made the events of May 1998 all the more shocking when they came to light. By the spring of that year, cracks in the marriage had deepened into something dangerous. While the world continued to laugh at Phil's characters on television, inside his own home, tension was reaching a breaking point. As the late 1990s unfolded, Phil Hartman's career was steady and thriving. But inside his home in Encino, the foundation of his marriage was cracking. To friends, he often appeared calm, as though he had learned to compartmentalize the chaos at home from the professionalism of his work. But Bryn's world was slipping further into instability. Her struggle with identity, jealousy, and substance abuse was becoming more evident, and those close to them began to sense the danger of where it all might lead. Bryn was known to oscillate between moments of warmth and volatility. On some days, she appeared to be a loving mother and supportive partner, but at other times her insecurities overwhelmed her. She had dreams of carving out her own career in Hollywood, but constant rejections and her husband's immense success only deepened her frustrations. Even as she attended rehabilitation programs in attempts to control her drug dependency, relapses were not uncommon. What made it even more troubling was how drastically her moods could swing under the influence of alcohol or narcotics. Phil, by contrast, avoided confrontation whenever possible. His colleagues noticed that he was the kind of man who withdrew into routine when life became too overwhelming. He often retreated into hobbies, boating, aviation, or simply spending quiet time at home. While his passive nature allowed him to maintain composure publicly, within the marriage it created distance. Instead of addressing conflicts directly, he often chose silence. For Bryn, this silence was interpreted not as calm but as rejection, widening the rift between them. Their two children, Sean and Bergen, became the silent witnesses to the atmosphere at home. Phil adored them, doted on them, and wanted to shield them from the turbulence. But even they could not remain entirely untouched by the emotional undercurrents. Visitors sometimes noticed the tension in the household, though it was often papered over with the facade of normal family life. In May of 1998, the cracks finally widened into irreparable fractures. On the evening of May 27th, Bryn had been out, reportedly visiting a friend and later going to a restaurant. At some point during the night, she consumed both alcohol and cocaine, substances that only heightened her fragile emotional state. Witnesses later recalled that she had seemed agitated, though no one could have predicted what she was about to do. Returning to the Encino home after midnight, Bryn confronted Phil. The argument that followed was one they had circled many times before. Her insecurities, her anger at his perceived emotional withdrawal, and his ultimatum that if she continued using drugs, their marriage could not survive. For Phil, this was not an empty threat. He had spoken to friends in confidence about his fear for the stability of their family. For Bryn, however, the words cut deep, igniting both her rage and her despair. The house was quiet except for their voices, muffled but tense. Phil, exhausted, eventually retreated to their bedroom, where he fell asleep. In the silence that followed, Bryn's emotions spiraled. Under the influence of drugs and alcohol, her jealousy and paranoia grew uncontrollable. At some point in those dark hours, she retrieved a .38 caliber revolver. She entered the bedroom where Phil lay sleeping. In an act that would shock the world, she raised the weapon and pulled the trigger 3 times. 2 bullets struck him in the head, 1 in the side. He died instantly, never waking to comprehend what had happened. The house, once filled with laughter and children's voices, was now a crime scene. Bryn, immediately realizing the gravity of what she had done, descended into panic. But instead of calling the police, she fled the house. She drove to the home of a friend, Ron Douglas, sometime in the early morning hours. When she arrived, she was distraught, incoherent, and trembling. At first, Ron could not make sense of her words. Bryn confessed that she had killed Phil, but her friend refused to believe her. To him, it sounded impossible, a rambling cry from someone who was intoxicated. Yet Bryn persisted, repeating the words, her desperation clear. After some time at Ron's house, she decided to drive back to Encino, leaving him disturbed and uncertain about what to do. As soon as she left, Ron called the police, reporting her frantic confession. Officers were immediately dispatched to the Hartman residence. By the time authorities arrived, the scene inside was haunting. They found Phil lifeless in the bedroom, his body still beneath the covers. The couple's children, Sean, aged 9, and Bergen, aged 6, were in the house. Officers quickly moved them to safety, shielding them from the horror of what had unfolded. Outside, the police attempted to negotiate with Bryn, who had locked herself inside after returning. For hours, law enforcement tried to reason with her, urging her to surrender peacefully. But Bryn, consumed by guilt, despair, and the fog of substances, could not face the reality of what she had done. In a final, irreversible act, she turned the revolver on herself and fired. By the time police entered the home, she was dead. She was just 40 years old. The murder-suicide sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of the Hartman home. News spread rapidly across Los Angeles, then across the country, and soon across the world. Hollywood had lost one of its brightest stars, not to natural causes, not to a slow decline, but to a sudden act of violence that seemed almost incomprehensible. Fans, colleagues, and friends struggled to reconcile the image of Phil Hartman, the man who had made millions laugh, with the brutal reality of his end. The entertainment industry reacted with disbelief. On the set of News Radio, cast and crew were devastated. The show had been preparing for another season, and Hartman's character was central to the ensemble. The producers eventually dedicated an episode to him, crafting a storyline in which his character passed away, allowing the cast to mourn both on screen and off. On The Simpsons, where his voice had brought to life unforgettable characters, writers retired his roles out of respect. Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz would never return, preserving them as tributes to Hartman's memory. Among his fellow comedians, the grief was profound. Those who had shared the stage with him on Saturday Night Live remembered him not only as a brilliant performer but also as a kind, grounded colleague. Tributes poured in from every corner of the entertainment world. The shock was not only in the loss but in the manner of it. The idea that someone so beloved, so respected, could be taken so suddenly in such a violent way left many grappling for answers. In the days that followed, more details emerged about the troubled marriage, Bryn's struggles, and the toxic undercurrents that had led to the tragedy. For many, it became a cautionary tale about the hidden battles that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly perfect lives. The Hartman home, once a place of family and success, became a symbol of Hollywood's darker underbelly, where fame and fortune cannot shield against personal demons. The tragedy also left behind two children, Sean and Bergen, whose lives were forever altered. Orphaned in a single night, they were taken in by relatives who tried to shield them from the media frenzy. For them, the legacy of that night was not a headline, but a lifelong burden. For the public, the narrative was almost unbearable. The comedian whose characters had embodied joy, killed by the woman he had once loved and trusted most. The details were dissected by the media, but the deeper truth, the human toll of addiction, mental health struggles, and unchecked conflict, remained less visible, though it lingered like a shadow over the story. By the time the funerals were held, the world had already canonized Hartman as one of comedy's greats, taken too soon. For Bryn, however, there was little sympathy. She was vilified, her name spoken with anger and blame. Yet behind her actions was a life of unfulfilled dreams, insecurities, and inner battles that had never found resolution. The juxtaposition of their lives, one soaring, one unraveling, came together in a single act that stunned the world. In the weeks following Phil Hartman's death, the shock had not subsided. The headlines continued to dominate newspapers and television broadcasts, not because of their sensational nature alone, but because the loss felt so personal to those who had welcomed him into their living rooms for years. There was a collective mourning, not only for a comedian whose talents were irreplaceable, but for a man whose life had ended in a way that few could make sense of. Funeral services drew friends, family, and colleagues from across the entertainment industry. Tributes painted a portrait of a man who was professional, generous, and deeply loved. At one memorial, his news radio co-star Dave Foley described Hartman as the most reliable person he had ever worked with, someone who never failed to bring steadiness and humor to the set. From Saturday Night Live, castmates shared stories of the man who was the backbone of their sketches, the one who could transform even the weakest script into something memorable. And for The Simpsons, writers and producers acknowledged the depth his voice had brought to their world, a contribution so unique it could never be replaced. Behind the public ceremonies, a quieter tragedy unfolded for the two children left behind. Sean and Bergen were suddenly at the center of a storm they had never asked for. With their father gone and their mother dead by her own hand, their world was shattered overnight. Extended family stepped in, determined to provide them with stability and protection from the unrelenting gaze of the press. To shield them, they were raised largely out of the spotlight, away from the industry that had both elevated their father and contributed to the pressures that consumed their mother. For the children, the years ahead would be marked by an attempt to carve out an identity separate from the tragedy that had defined their early lives. As the immediate shock faded, the story of Phil Hartman began to be analyzed through a different lens. Commentators and psychologists pointed to Bryn's struggles with addiction and mental health, to the dynamics of a marriage where one partner's career eclipsed the other's, and to the tragic mix of insecurity, substance abuse, and silence that had culminated in violence. The entertainment industry, while devastated, was also forced to confront uncomfortable questions. How many other performers lived behind facades of success while their private lives unraveled? How often were substance abuse and untreated emotional struggles overlooked until it was too late? For audiences, the grief was bound up with nostalgia. Phil Hartman had played characters who embodied humor that was both sharp and accessible. His Bill Clinton impression was not merely funny but insightful, cutting to the heart of a politician's charm and flaws. Troy McClure, with his exaggerated charisma, had become a cultural reference point. Bill McNeil on news radio was arrogant, ridiculous, yet strangely endearing. These roles remained frozen in time, reminders of his talent but also of what could have been if he had lived longer. Fans clung to reruns, to sketches, to recordings of his voice, as if replaying them might hold back the reality of his absence. The impact of his death rippled outward into the shows he had left behind. For news radio, his absence was not only a logistical problem for the scriptwriters but an emotional wound for the cast. They filmed a special episode to say goodbye to his character, Bill McNeil, blending fiction with raw grief. Viewers who tuned in saw more than a storyline. They saw actors mourning a real friend. For The Simpsons, the decision was made to retire his characters permanently. It was both a tribute and a silence that could never be filled. Each time fans watched Troy McClure wink and say, "You might remember me from," it carried with it a pang of loss. In the years that followed, the narrative around Phil Hartman's death took on the shape of a cautionary tale. Documentaries and retrospective programs revisited the case, dissecting the night of the murder and the troubled relationship that preceded it. But beneath the sensational coverage lay a deeper sadness. This was not only a story of a crime. It was a story of a man whose joy, kindness, and artistry had touched millions, extinguished by forces of insecurity and addiction that neither fame nor fortune could keep at bay. For Bryn, the woman who pulled the trigger, public opinion was harsh and unforgiving. She was cast as the villain, the jealous wife who destroyed a brilliant man. Yet within some corners of the discussion, there were those who urged a more nuanced view. Bryn was, after all, a woman battling her own demons, substance abuse, rejection, mental health struggles. And while these did not excuse her actions, they illuminated the complexity of the tragedy. Some argued that her story, too, was a warning about what happens when inner battles are left untreated and unacknowledged. For Phil's colleagues, memories of him remained vibrant. They spoke of his professionalism, his ability to make others better, his humility despite his immense talent. He was not the loudest person in the room, but the one who could anchor chaos with calm precision. Over and over, people described him as the glue, a phrase that seemed to capture both his role in ensembles and his role in life. In the decades since his death, Hartman's legacy has endured. Younger generations continue to discover his work, whether through old SNL sketches, reruns of news radio, or episodes of The Simpsons. His characters remain timeless, their humor undiminished by the passing years. More importantly, his story continues to spark conversations about the human cost of addiction, the fragility of relationships under the strain of fame, and the hidden struggles that can lurk behind even the brightest smiles. For Sean and Bergen, growing up without their parents was undoubtedly a heavy burden. Yet, reports in later years suggested that they were able to find paths of their own, nurtured by family and kept deliberately away from the spotlight. In interviews and rare public appearances, Bergen has spoken of her father with pride, remembering him as a man who loved deeply, who was kind, and who was far more than the characters he portrayed. In this way, the private memory of Phil Hartman endures beyond the public tragedy. The murder of Phil Hartman was not simply a crime. It was the collapse of a life that had brought joy to countless others. It revealed, in the starkest terms, the divide between public image and private reality. The laughter he gave to the world was real, but so too were the struggles behind closed doors. His death was a reminder that even those who seemed to have everything, success, admiration, family, may be fighting battles invisible to the outside world. Today, when audiences revisit his performances, the laughter still comes easily. The talent is undeniable, the characters unforgettable. But layered into that laughter is an echo of sorrow, a reminder of the fragility of human life and the consequences of pain left unspoken. Phil Hartman's story remains one of Hollywood's most haunting tragedies not because it ended in violence alone, but because of what was lost. A man of immense talent, a father, a colleague, a friend, gone in a moment that could never be undone. In the end, his legacy is twofold. On one hand, He will always be remembered as a comedic genius, whose work continues to entertain and inspire. On the other, his death serves as a cautionary tale, a stark illustration of how substance abuse, untreated insecurities, and unresolved conflict can converge into catastrophe. Together, these truths form the story of Phil Hartman, a story where laughter and tragedy remain forever intertwined. In 2012, a package arrived at a political office in Canada. Inside was a human foot. What began as a grotesque mystery unraveled into a global manhunt for a narcissistic killer who filmed his crime. This is the chilling story of Luka Magnotta and the life he destroyed. The crime that would come to define Luka Magnotta's name forever did not erupt out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of disturbing behavior, online obsession, and an escalating need for attention that went unchecked until it ended in tragedy. To understand the horrific events of May 2012, it is necessary to look closely at the man behind them. A man who built an image of himself through smoke and mirrors, whose life revolved around vanity, deception, and a disturbing hunger for notoriety. Born Eric Clinton Kirk Newman in 1982, he grew up in Toronto in what he later described as a troubled environment. His early years were marked by instability, and his relationship with family members was strained. As he grew older, he began experimenting with reinvention, abandoning his given name and adopting the more glamorous-sounding identity of Luka Magnotta. It was the persona he hoped would lead him into modeling and entertainment, a stage name carefully chosen to sound unique and memorable. Behind the mask of beauty and charm, however, darker impulses seemed to simmer. He drifted through a series of odd jobs, dabbling in adult films, escort services, and low-level modeling gigs, but none of it gave him the fame he desperately craved. Instead, Magnotta turned increasingly to the internet, where he cultivated a digital presence designed to project an image of sophistication and allure. Online, he posted countless photos of himself, edited and filtered to perfection. He created multiple identities and spread rumors about himself, even orchestrating campaigns where he would post damaging gossip under false names and then deny it, ensuring his name circulated in online forums. He seemed obsessed with recognition, whether positive or negative. It was not enough to exist quietly. Magnotta wanted to be noticed, and in this relentless pursuit of attention, disturbing tendencies began to show themselves. One of the earliest warning signs came when animal rights groups sounded alarms about videos that surfaced online showing kittens being killed in brutal ways. Though at first the identity of the perpetrator was hidden, internet sleuths began connecting the dots and pointing toward Magnotta. The footage showed a calm, deliberate cruelty that shocked viewers. Online communities launched campaigns to track him down, creating detailed dossiers on his movements, photos, and aliases. Magnotta denied involvement, dismissing the accusations as part of a campaign of harassment against him, but suspicions continued to grow. For those who followed the case, it felt inevitable that the person behind such cruelty might one day escalate to harming humans. By 2012, Luka Magnotta was living in Montreal, residing in a small apartment that gave little hint of the horror it would soon house. His life appeared fractured. Neighbors recalled him as a man who kept to himself, who sometimes seemed nervous or distracted, and who rarely made much contact with those around him. Yet beneath this quiet exterior, he was constructing a plan that would shock the world. The lines between his fantasies and reality had blurred. He wanted more than internet infamy. He wanted to cement his place in history, no matter the cost. His choice of victim, Jun Lin, seemed tragically arbitrary. Jun Lin was a 33-year-old international student from Wuhan, China, who had come to Canada to study computer engineering at Concordia University. Friends described him as kind-hearted, hard-working, and hopeful about his future. He had built a life in Montreal, balancing studies with a part-time job, and was described as someone eager to make the most of his opportunities abroad. To those who knew him, he represented a story of resilience and ambition, far removed from the chaos of the man who would end his life. In late May 2012, Jun Lin and Luka Magnotta crossed paths. How exactly Magnotta lured him remains uncertain, though investigators believed it began with an online interaction. Jun Lin was known to use dating apps and social platforms, and Magnotta, with his habit of trolling for attention online, may have reached out under one of his personas. What is clear is that Lin eventually came to Magnotta's apartment. It was there that he was subjected to an act of violence so grotesque that the details would haunt investigators and audiences around the world. The killing itself was not just an act of murder but a performance, carefully staged and filmed. Magnotta recorded the attack and released it under the now infamous title One Lunatic, One Ice Pick. In the footage, Lin is bound, assaulted, and brutally murdered with weapons that included an ice pick and knife. The scene was grotesque not only for the act itself but for the casual, deliberate way it was filmed. Magnotta appeared to revel in his role as both killer and director, choreographing horror for an online audience. For those who later saw the video, it was among the most disturbing crimes ever captured on camera. The crime did not end with the killing. Afterward, Magnotta dismembered June Lin's body, disposing of it in multiple ways. Some parts were left behind in his apartment, while others were packed into parcels and mailed across Canada to political offices and schools. It was a calculated act meant not just to desecrate the victim, but to provoke fear, confusion, and media frenzy. He wanted people talking about him, and he ensured that they would. When investigators first learned of the case, it was not through the discovery of the body but through the arrival of those grisly packages. On May 29, 2012, staff at the Conservative Party headquarters in Ottawa opened a package to find a human foot wrapped inside. On the same day, another package containing a human hand was intercepted en route to a school in Vancouver. The shocking deliveries sparked immediate alarm. Police scrambled to understand the origin, and forensic analysis confirmed the parts belonged to the same victim. Meanwhile, in Montreal, residents of a small apartment building reported a stench emanating from one unit. When authorities entered, they found a blood-soaked scene, evidence of a violent struggle and dismemberment, alongside a suitcase containing additional body parts. The victim was soon identified as June Lin. News of the crime spread rapidly, drawing international attention. The brutality of the murder, coupled with the grotesque mailing of body parts, made it unlike anything Canadian authorities had encountered. What deepened the horror was the existence of the video, which circulated online and horrified anyone who came across it. Investigators quickly pieced together evidence that pointed to Luka Magnotta as the perpetrator. His apartment was drenched in blood. Personal belongings tied him to the scene. The video itself showed him, unmistakably, committing the crime. But by the time police closed in, Magnotta was gone. He had already fled Montreal, disappearing into the international transit system. His departure turned the case into a worldwide manhunt. Interpol was alerted, and news agencies across the globe reported on the fugitive, dubbed the Canadian Psycho. The nickname, borrowed from the title of a film found among his belongings, reinforced the public perception of him as a figure who blurred the line between reality and horror cinema. For days, his whereabouts remained uncertain. Reports placed him in Paris, where he stayed briefly before slipping away again. He left a trail of sightings, moving from city to city, his face appearing on wanted posters and news broadcasts. Authorities feared he might vanish entirely into Europe, protected by the anonymity of large cities and his knack for creating false identities. Yet despite his attempts to evade capture, his narcissism betrayed him. He could not resist following the media coverage of his own crime. And it was that compulsion, that desperate need to watch himself become infamous, that would ultimately lead to his downfall. As the first part of this story unfolded, it became clear that Luka Magnotta was not just a killer, but someone who engineered his crime for maximum impact. He wanted the world to see it, to discuss it, and to know his name. And in the early days of the investigation, he got exactly what he wanted. International attention, a media storm, and a manhunt that would span continents. The escape of Luka Magnotta transformed a horrific crime scene in Montreal into an international spectacle. Within hours of police linking him to June Lin's murder, his face was broadcast across television networks, splashed on front pages, and distributed through Interpol as part of a Red Notice alert. For the Canadian authorities, it was not just about solving a brutal crime anymore. It had become a race against time to catch a fugitive whose movements were unpredictable and whose mind was proving dangerously unstable. When Magnotta boarded a plane out of Canada, he vanished into Europe's vast network of cities. He slipped into Paris, a metropolis of millions, where he seemed to revel in the anonymity that came with being just another face in the crowd. Investigators later traced his path to a small hotel room where he had briefly stayed. Inside, they found discarded items, pornographic magazines, receipts, and traces of his journey that confirmed he had passed through. Paris police scoured areas of the city where he was rumored to have been spotted. Cafes, internet shops, and nightclubs, but every time they drew close, he managed to disappear again. While authorities scrambled to track him physically, his online presence remained strangely active. Computer analysts discovered that even as he was on the run, he searched for news articles about himself. In internet cafes across France and Germany, he logged on to social media and forums, monitoring the growing media frenzy. It was as though he could not resist the pull of his own infamy. Detectives began to suspect that this obsession with self-image might become the key to finding him. Interpol, meanwhile, intensified its efforts. The Red Notice made him one of the most wanted men in the world, and border security agents across Europe were alerted to watch for any sign of him. Still, Magnotta had spent years perfecting the art of reinvention, traveling under aliases, using false documents, and adopting different personas. This made his movements difficult to pin down. Investigators described the chase as both frustrating and surreal. They were hunting a man who seemed determined to leave traces behind, yet elusive enough to remain just out of reach. In Canada, the story dominated headlines. Journalists dissected every aspect of Magnotta's life: his troubled childhood, his string of minor modeling gigs, his connections to the disturbing kitten-killing videos. Talk shows speculated on his motives, psychiatrists debated his state of mind, and members of the public questioned how someone with such a history of troubling behavior had been allowed to slip through the cracks. The nickname Canadian Psycho spread quickly, conjuring images of a man who blurred fantasy with real-life violence. The family of June Lin watched all of this unfold with quiet grief, mourning the son and brother who had come to Canada in search of a future, only to have his life stolen in a manner that seemed almost theatrical in its cruelty. As days passed, sightings began to shift from Paris to Berlin. The German capital, with its bustling districts and transient population, became the next stage for Magnotta's attempted disappearance. Witnesses later recalled seeing him in various neighborhoods, often alone, carrying little more than a small bag. He seemed restless, drifting from one temporary location to another, yet always circling back to internet cafes where he could feed his obsession with media coverage. The fugitive hunt had taken on the qualities of a psychological duel. Law enforcement methodically tracing his steps, and Magnotta leaving behind subtle clues that reflected his vanity more than a true desire to vanish completely. By June 4, 2012, that vanity proved his undoing. In the working-class district of Neukölln, inside a modest internet cafe, Magnotta sat at a computer scrolling through news reports about himself. To the staff, he looked vaguely familiar, his face echoing the wanted posters that had circulated in Germany. One employee, suspicious, compared the man in front of him to the images plastered across television broadcasts. Convinced it was the fugitive, he quietly alerted local police. Within minutes, officers entered the cafe. Magnotta looked up, startled but calm, and offered little resistance. According to reports, the final confirmation came when he uttered the words, "You got me." His capture brought an immediate sense of relief across Canada and beyond. After nearly a week of frenzied headlines and escalating fear, the world had its conclusion to the manhunt. But even in custody, Magnotta's behavior unsettled those around him. German officers noted his detached demeanor, his apparent lack of concern for the gravity of the crimes he had been accused of. For many, it underscored the chilling impression of a man consumed by self-image rather than conscience. Extradition proceedings followed swiftly. Canada requested his return to stand trial, and Germany cooperated. He was placed under heavy security, escorted back across the Atlantic to face the charges awaiting him. When his plane touched down in Montreal, crowds of reporters gathered to capture the moment. Cameras flashed as he was led away by officers, his face shielded but unmistakable. The spectacle of his return symbolized not just the resolution of a manhunt but the beginning of another chapter, the judicial reckoning for a crime that had horrified millions. As preparations for trial began, investigators meticulously pieced together the evidence. The video, widely known by then, stood as perhaps the most damning piece. Though only fragments had circulated on public forums, police had secured the full recording. Every frame was scrutinized, not only for its shocking content but for the insight it provided into Magnotta's intentions. The methodical staging, the deliberate recording, and the posting online were seen as proof of calculation rather than insanity. Forensic evidence further tied him to the scene. Fingerprints on the packages, DNA from the apartment, and personal belongings linking him to Jun Lin. Prosecutors assembled a case that painted Magnotta as a man who planned his crime for maximum exposure. They argued that this was not the spontaneous act of someone who had lost control, but the carefully orchestrated performance of a narcissist seeking notoriety. They highlighted his history of online self-promotion, the cruelty of the kitten videos, and his repeated attempts to manufacture attention through fabricated scandals. In their narrative, the murder of Jun Lin was the grim culmination of these escalating behaviors. The defense, however, presented a different story. They contended that Magnotta was suffering from severe mental illness at the time of the crime, specifically schizophrenia. They pointed to his history of psychiatric treatment and claimed that he could not fully comprehend his actions or distinguish reality from delusion. To bolster their case, they brought in medical experts who described a man plagued by paranoia and delusional thinking. They argued that while the crime was undeniably horrific, it was the act of someone whose mind was fundamentally broken. As the trial loomed, the Canadian public braced itself for what promised to be one of the most sensational legal proceedings in the nation's history. The case had already gripped international audiences with its combination of brutality, internet infamy, and cinematic flight from justice. Now it would enter a courtroom, where the question shifted from, who did this? To why did it happen, and what responsibility should be assigned? In Montreal, the courthouse became a stage for the next act of the story. Journalists filled the seats, sketch artists prepared their pads, and families, Jun Lin's loved ones and Luka Magnotta's relatives alike, sat with heavy hearts. It was the collision of two lives. One cut short in a moment of horror, the other now defined forever by that act. The prosecution and defense sharpened their arguments. Witnesses prepared to recount painful details, and the world waited to hear whether Luka Magnotta would be judged as a calculating murderer or a mentally ill man lost in his own delusions. When Luka Magnotta was finally brought to trial in 2014, the courtroom atmosphere was unlike anything Canada had witnessed in recent memory. The combination of gruesome evidence, international intrigue, and the unsettling presence of the accused gave the proceedings the aura of both tragedy and spectacle. For Jun Lin's family, who had traveled from China to attend, the trial was not just a legal battle but a painful confrontation with the last moments of their loved one's life. Every word, every image, every detail threatened to reopen wounds that had not begun to heal. The courtroom was packed day after day. Journalists from across the globe secured seats, their pens racing to capture each detail for headlines that would cross borders. Observers were struck by Magnotta's demeanor. He sat quietly, often expressionless, his gaze shifting only occasionally, his body language calm in the face of testimony that described his acts in unsparing detail. For some, his composure was chilling, as though he remained detached from the horror being discussed around him. For others, it was evidence of someone lost within himself, disconnected from the consequences of his actions. The prosecution opened with a stark narrative. This was the deliberate act of a man who sought infamy. They laid out the chain of events in precise order, presenting the video, the dismemberment, the mailing of body parts, and the flight to Europe as interconnected parts of a calculated plan. Witness after witness confirmed the evidence that tied him to the crime: DNA samples, fingerprints, online postings, and surveillance footage. For the jury, the sheer weight of material evidence left little doubt about the basic facts. The question was not whether Magnotta had committed the crime, but what his state of mind had been when he did it. The defense countered with its argument of diminished responsibility. They called psychiatric experts who testified that Magnotta suffered from schizophrenia, a condition that could distort his perception of reality and impair his judgment. Doctors described patterns of paranoia, delusions, and a fragile grip on the world around him. They emphasized that his long-standing history of psychiatric treatment indicated a man at war with his own mind, someone not fully in control when he committed the acts. Their plea was not for acquittal but for understanding, that the crime was the result of illness rather than evil. Throughout the trial, the video of the killing hovered like a dark cloud. The jury was required to view it, though access was tightly restricted due to its disturbing nature. The reactions in the room were somber, the silence heavy after the screen went dark. For many jurors, it was a moment that underscored the brutality of the act in a way no testimony could fully convey. The footage revealed intent, planning, and a chilling awareness of the camera. Prosecutors argued that these qualities contradicted the notion of someone lost in psychosis. The testimony of Jun Lin's friends and family provided the trial with a voice of humanity amid the horror. They spoke of a young man who had crossed an ocean in search of opportunity, who had been filled with dreams of a brighter future. They described his kindness, his dedication, and the pain of losing him in such an unimaginable way. Their words reminded the jury that beyond the debate over mental illness and criminal intent, there was a victim whose life had been cut short, whose absence left an unfillable void. As weeks turned into months, the jury absorbed complex arguments, detailed forensic evidence, and emotional testimony. The prosecution painted Magnotta as a manipulative narcissist who had choreographed a murder for attention. The defense portrayed him as a fragile man overwhelmed by mental illness, incapable of grasping the enormity of what he had done. Both sides acknowledged the horror of the crime but asked the jury to see it through different lenses, one of deliberate calculation, the other of psychological collapse. When the time came for the jury to deliberate, the weight of responsibility was immense. They were tasked not only with determining guilt but with interpreting intent, a challenge that required them to balance evidence with human psychology. For 8 days, they reviewed testimony, re-examined evidence, and debated the meaning of actions that seemed at once deliberate and deranged. On December 23, 2014, the verdict was announced. Luka Magnotta was found guilty of first-degree murder, as well as other charges including committing indignities to a body, publishing obscene material, and mailing obscene matter. The sentence was life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The jury had rejected the defense's claim of diminished responsibility, siding instead with the prosecution's argument that the crime was carefully planned and executed. The verdict brought closure of a kind, but not relief. For Jun Lin's family, there was the bitter comfort of justice but no undoing of their loss. They returned to China with the knowledge that their son's story had become one of the most notorious cases in modern Canadian history. For the public, the trial's conclusion left lingering questions about the interplay of mental illness, internet culture, and the thirst for fame. In the aftermath, discussions about Luka Magnotta extended far beyond the courtroom. Scholars, journalists, and psychologists dissected the case as a disturbing intersection of digital-age narcissism and violent crime. The existence of the video, the role of online sleuths in tracking his earlier activities, and the international nature of his flight all contributed to the sense that this was a crime of its era, amplified by technology and global media. Documentaries and investigative programs revisited the story, piecing together timelines and interviewing those who had tried to sound warnings years earlier. Many pointed to the videos of animal cruelty as a missed opportunity, an early sign that escalating violence might lie ahead. Others reflected on the way Magnotta manipulated the internet to both build his persona and feed his compulsions. The case became a grim reminder of how online behavior can foreshadow real-world consequences. Behind prison walls, Magnotta's life faded from public view, but his name remained etched into the annals of Canadian criminal history. His correspondence with journalists and occasional public letters hinted at a man still eager for attention, though the world had largely moved on. For the legal system, the case underscored the importance of balancing compassion for mental illness with accountability for deliberate acts of violence. For society, it was a haunting reminder of how easily one individual's obsession with notoriety could spiral into tragedy. The memory of Jun Lin endured in contrast. His friends at Concordia University held vigils in his honor, remembering not the gruesome way he died but the kindness and optimism with which he lived. Professors spoke of his dedication to his studies, peers recalled his warmth, and his family cherished the memory of a son whose potential was stolen but whose spirit they carried with them. Years later, the story continues to echo in conversations about true crime, media ethics, and the dangers of unchecked online behavior. It serves as a case study for criminologists, a warning for policymakers, and a sorrowful chapter for those who knew June Lin personally. Though justice was served in a legal sense, the broader lessons remain unresolved. How to identify and intervene before disturbing behavior escalates, how to balance the right to free expression online with the risks it can pose, and how to protect vulnerable individuals from those who seek to exploit them for their own dark narratives. The case of Luka Magnotta is not remembered simply for its brutality but for its reflection of deeper issues. It exposed the fragility of human life in the face of obsession, the dangers of seeking fame at any cost, and the pain left behind when tragedy strikes. It forced a confrontation with questions about morality, mental health, and responsibility that remain relevant today. And at its heart, it remains the story of June Lin, a young man whose life was ended in violence but whose memory endures as a symbol of resilience, hope, and the human cost of one man's descent into infamy. By the end of January 1947, despite relentless coverage and police work, the investigation was stalling. Leads that had seemed promising turned out to be dead ends. Suspects were interviewed, interrogated, and cleared, leaving detectives frustrated. The media circus continued, with headlines speculating about sadistic killers, medical professionals, or connections to Hollywood elites. The murder had transformed into a cultural fee. In 1947, Los Angeles awoke to a nightmare. An aspiring actress, Elizabeth Short, found mutilated and posed in a vacant lot. Dubbed the Black Dahlia, her murder became Hollywood's darkest mystery. Who killed her and why? 8 decades later, the chilling truth still hides in the city's shadows. In the years following World War II, Los Angeles was a city brimming with promise, glamour, and shadowy contradictions. It was a place where veterans returned home to new opportunities, where Hollywood's golden age was dazzling audiences worldwide, and where young dreamers arrived daily in search of fame. Yet beneath the glitter of the film industry, the city's underbelly was plagued with crime, corruption, and desperation. It was within this atmosphere that the story of Elizabeth Short, later immortalized as the Black Dahlia, unfolded. Elizabeth's journey to Los Angeles was one of countless hopefuls who saw the city as a gateway to reinvention. Born in Massachusetts, she had a modest upbringing marked by instability, particularly after her father abandoned the family during the Great Depression. This fractured early life instilled in her a sense of longing for stability, for belonging, and for recognition. When she eventually gravitated toward Los Angeles, she carried with her not only youthful ambition, but also a vulnerability that left her exposed in a city known for preying on dreamers. The Los Angeles of the 1940s was a paradox. On one hand, the film studios flourished, producing stars who defined American culture. On the other, corruption simmered within the LAPD, prostitution and organized crime thrived, and the illusion of Hollywood often devoured those who came chasing it. For a young woman like Elizabeth, who was charming, social, but financially insecure, survival meant relying on acquaintances, drifting from one temporary arrangement to another. She cultivated a glamorous image, often wearing stylish black clothing, but behind the poise was a woman struggling to find her place. When her body was discovered in January 1947, the horrific nature of the crime immediately turned her from an obscure actress into a name known across the country. Yet to understand the magnitude of the case, one must consider not only the brutality of her murder but also the social landscape that magnified it. The city was already on edge. Post-war Los Angeles was grappling with rising crime rates and public mistrust of institutions. The grisly discovery seemed to confirm fears that beneath the city's bright exterior lurked an unforgiving darkness. The press wasted no time seizing upon the spectacle. Within hours of the discovery, newspaper reporters swarmed the neighborhood, sketching graphic details of the crime scene for a hungry readership. The name Black Dahlia was coined almost immediately, drawing from both a recent noir film and Elizabeth's personal style. The moniker was sensational, marketable, and tragically dehumanizing. It transformed her from a victim into a symbol. The case became front-page news, not only for its savagery but because it tapped into the public's simultaneous fascination with glamour and fear of corruption. The investigation launched by the LAPD was one of the most extensive in its history. Detectives canvassed neighborhoods, interviewed witnesses, and combed through Elizabeth's known connections. At first, the police seemed confident they would make swift progress. But the gruesome precision of the crime baffled them. The body had been meticulously drained of blood, bisected with surgical skill, and cleaned before being posed. These elements suggested knowledge beyond that of an ordinary killer. Speculation grew that the perpetrator was someone with medical training, perhaps a surgeon. Despite the early momentum, the investigation was soon derailed by overwhelming pressure from the press and the sheer scale of public fascination. Newspapers published sensationalized accounts, sometimes exaggerating or inventing details to keep readers hooked. In doing so, they muddied the facts and created an atmosphere of hysteria. Reporters even went so far as to impersonate police officers in order to access witnesses. For detectives, separating truth from fiction became increasingly difficult. The case was not only a murder investigation, it was a battle for control of the narrative. False leads poured in from every direction. Self-proclaimed killers sent letters to the police and the press, some taunting investigators, others offering elaborate confessions. None of these claims held up under scrutiny, but each one drained resources and distracted from the real task. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's life was dissected in the papers, often with little regard for accuracy. She was portrayed as everything from a troubled drifter to a promiscuous party girl. These characterizations, often rooted in misogyny, shaped public perception and clouded the investigation. As detectives struggled to piece together Elizabeth's final days, they encountered a network of friends, acquaintances, and casual companions. She had spent her last weeks moving between hotels, apartments, and acquaintances' homes, a lifestyle that made tracing her movements difficult. Witness accounts were contradictory, and many of those who had crossed paths with her remembered only fragments. The city's transient social scene, combined with Elizabeth's habit of drifting between connections, meant that the timeline leading up to her murder remained fractured. The sheer brutality of the killing and the lack of progress in solving it forced the LAPD into an uncomfortable spotlight. Questions were raised about the competence of the department and the integrity of its officers. Corruption scandals had already plagued the force in the 1930s and 1940s, and the Black Dahlia case became a litmus test for public trust. When weeks passed without a clear suspect, the pressure mounted, not just to solve the murder but to restore credibility. Behind the spectacle, however, was a very human tragedy. Elizabeth Short, stripped of her identity and reduced to the moniker Black Dahlia, became more myth than person in the public imagination. Yet those who knew her remembered her as a young woman who laughed easily, who dreamed of being noticed for her talent rather than her death, and who navigated a city that offered little kindness to women like her. For her family back in Massachusetts, the crime was not only devastating but compounded by the cruelty of the coverage. They had to read about Elizabeth in headlines that sensationalized her life rather than honoring it. Nomnon, but the truth of what happened to Elizabeth remained elusive. What made the Black Dahlia case so uniquely disturbing was the intersection of brutality, mystery, and media frenzy. It was not just a murder. It was a story that exposed the vulnerabilities of Los Angeles, the corruption within its police force, the ruthlessness of its media, and the dangers faced by women who came to the city in search of dreams. For many, Elizabeth Short came to represent the cost of ambition in a place where fame was dangled like a prize, yet safety was never guaranteed. As winter turned to spring, the city moved forward, but the crime lingered. Neighbors who had discovered the body could not forget the horror. Detectives carried the frustration of unanswered questions, and the public, enthralled by the spectacle, demanded answers that never arrived. The Black Dahlia murder was already on its way to becoming more than a case file. It was a legend, one that would outlive the men tasked with solving it and remain unsolved for generations. As the initial wave of media frenzy began to subside, the investigation into Elizabeth Short's murder entered a more complicated phase. The early chaos of tips, hoaxes, and fabricated confessions had left detectives drained, but the unanswered brutality of the crime ensured that they could not abandon the pursuit. What emerged in the months that followed was a patchwork of suspects, theories, and institutional failures that revealed as much about Los Angeles in the 1940s as it did about the murder itself. One of the central challenges facing investigators was the sheer number of potential suspects. Elizabeth had crossed paths with so many individuals in her brief time in Los Angeles that almost anyone who knew her could have been considered. Men she had dated, acquaintances she had stayed with, and strangers who had only fleeting contact all came under scrutiny. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, searching for inconsistencies or suspicious behavior, but the interviews often raised more questions than answers. Many of the men she had known described her fondly but also spoke of her vulnerability, her dependence on others for shelter, her constant search for companionship, and her tendency to drift without clear plans. For investigators, these details painted a portrait of someone whose lifestyle made her tragically susceptible to exploitation. Despite the overwhelming number of possible leads, a few suspects began to attract more serious attention. Among them were several men with backgrounds in medicine, a detail that seemed to align with the precision of the mutilations on Elizabeth's body. Surgeons, medical students, and even dentists were scrutinized, as the clean bisection of her torso was believed to require anatomical knowledge. Yet every promising lead seemed to collapse under closer examination. Medical professionals were questioned, alibis were checked, and while suspicion lingered, no definitive evidence ever surfaced. The lack of progress deepened frustration within the LAPD, and cracks in the investigation began to show. Internal conflicts arose as detectives disagreed about which leads to prioritize. Some were convinced that the answer lay within Elizabeth's social circle, while others believed the murder was the work of a sadistic stranger with no personal connection to her. The uncertainty made coordination difficult, and the constant intrusion of the press only compounded the tension. Journalists hounded detectives for updates, sometimes learning details that were supposed to remain confidential. In this way, the media almost became another adversary in the investigation, shaping public opinion and putting pressure on investigators to deliver results they could not guarantee. At the same time, the LAPD itself was under scrutiny. Public confidence in the department had already been shaken by scandals in the years prior. Allegations of corruption, payoffs, and connections to organized crime plagued the force. The Black Dahlia case became a proving ground for the department. Yet the more time passed without progress, the more it fed suspicion that incompetence or even intentional obstruction might be at play. Rumors circulated that the department was protecting influential figures, that leads pointing to wealthy or powerful suspects were being quietly dismissed. Whether these suspicions were true or simply a reflection of the city's distrust, they added yet another layer of intrigue to the already complex story. Among the various suspects considered, none would become as infamous as Dr. George Hodel. At the time of the murder, Hodel was a respected but eccentric physician in Los Angeles. His name did not initially dominate the investigation, but decades later, suspicions about his involvement would resurface through the work of his own son, Steve Hodel, a former LAPD detective. Steve claimed that his father not only had the medical expertise to commit the crime but also the psychological disposition. George Hodel's life was marked by scandal, accusations of abuse, rumored involvement in underground circles, and a fascination with surrealist art that sometimes celebrated violence and dismemberment. Steve later argued that the surgical precision of the Black Dahlia murder mirrored his father's skills and mindset. Although George Hodel was never formally charged, the suspicion that he may have been the killer remains one of the most enduring theories, largely because of the disturbing overlap between his known behavior and the details of the crime. But George Hodel was far from the only figure in the sprawling web of suspects. Others included former lovers of Elizabeth, men who admitted to jealousy or resentment, and individuals with criminal backgrounds who might have encountered her. The sheer number of possible perpetrators became its own obstacle. The more suspects considered, the harder it became to isolate any single one with credible evidence. Even years later, private investigators and armchair detectives would continue adding names to the list, turning the case into a maze of competing theories. While detectives struggled to narrow their focus, the media continued to shape public perception of Elizabeth Short. Tabloids painted her as a femme fatale, insinuating promiscuity and scandal, even though much of this portrayal was exaggerated or unfounded. Such coverage had a dual effect. It kept the case alive in the public imagination, but it also undermined sympathy for Elizabeth as a victim. By framing her as a mysterious, dangerous woman, The press fed a narrative that made it easier for the public to accept her as the casualty of a sordid life, rather than as a young woman destroyed by a monstrous act of violence. This victim-blaming lens distorted the legacy of Elizabeth Short, ensuring that her story was remembered less for her humanity and more for the grotesque circumstances of her death. As the months turned into years, the Black Dahlia investigation remained technically open but practically stagnant. New leads occasionally surfaced. Letters sent to newspapers, alleged sightings of suspicious figures, confessions that seemed convincing at first, but each ultimately dissolved under scrutiny. Detectives retired, files were shuffled, and the case gradually transitioned from an active pursuit to a haunting, unsolved mystery. For the LAPD, it became a lingering stain, a reminder of a case that exposed their vulnerabilities and failures. For the public, it became a legend, a story retold through whispers, articles, and eventually books and films. The enduring fascination with the Black Dahlia murder can be traced to more than just the crime itself. It encapsulated the contradictions of Los Angeles, a city where glamour and violence coexisted, where dreams and nightmares blurred. Elizabeth's murder was not an isolated event. It reflected broader anxieties about women's safety, about the dangers of ambition, and about the moral cost of a city built on illusion. To many, her story became emblematic of the darker side of Hollywood, a reminder that behind the lights and cameras lurked predatory forces waiting to exploit the vulnerable. By the late 1940s and into the 1950s, the Black Dahlia murder had become a reference point in American culture. It was compared to other high-profile crimes, cited in discussions about law enforcement reform, and gradually absorbed into the mythology of Los Angeles. The case's notoriety ensured that it would never fade entirely from memory, even as new crimes and scandals captured headlines. Each retelling, however, carried its own interpretation. Some focused on the gruesome details, others on the institutional failures, and still others on the tragic life of Elizabeth Short. What remained constant was the void at the center of the case, the absence of definitive answers. The brutality of the crime demanded explanation, yet none came. Theories multiplied, suspects were debated, but certainty remained out of reach. For many, that absence itself became the defining feature of the Black Dahlia murder. It was a puzzle without a solution, a mirror reflecting not only the crime but the collective anxieties and obsessions of the society that consumed it. As the decades passed, the murder transitioned from a police file into folklore. Writers, filmmakers, and artists mined the story for inspiration, often emphasizing its noir qualities. The shadowed streets of post-war Los Angeles, the femme fatale imagery projected onto Elizabeth, the corrupt institutions lurking in the background. In this way, the Black Dahlia ceased to be solely a true crime case and became a cultural symbol, representing the darkness beneath Hollywood's golden surface. Yet in doing so, the real Elizabeth Short was further obscured, her dreams and her humanity swallowed by myth. In the decades that followed Elizabeth Short's death, the Black Dahlia case refused to fade into obscurity. While thousands of murders occurred in Los Angeles and across the United States in the years that followed, few carried the same haunting resonance. Each passing decade seemed to renew interest in the mystery, as if the city itself was unwilling to let the memory rest. The unanswered questions lingered in the public consciousness, growing not weaker with time but stronger, becoming a puzzle that each new generation felt compelled to revisit. Part of this enduring fascination stemmed from the way the case blurred the lines between reality and fiction. Los Angeles, a city already defined by storytelling, turned the murder into a narrative that invited constant reinterpretation. Writers, journalists, and eventually filmmakers returned again and again to the image of Elizabeth Short, her life, her death, and the grotesque staging of her body. The noir qualities of the case seemed almost cinematic. A young woman seeking fame, a city cloaked in shadows, corrupt institutions, and a violent end that was both theatrical and incomprehensible. These elements ensured that Elizabeth's story was not only remembered but mythologized. By the 1960s and 1970s, true crime writing began to flourish, and the Black Dahlia case was a natural subject. Books and investigative pieces attempted to re-examine the evidence, often drawing new conclusions or pointing fingers at fresh suspects. Each retelling, however, was limited by the same fundamental obstacle: the lack of conclusive physical evidence and the passage of time. Witnesses aged or died, files were misplaced, and memories blurred. This vacuum allowed speculation to thrive. Authors could craft elaborate theories, and even if their ideas were circumstantial, the absence of a definitive answer left room for belief. The case also intersected with cultural shifts in how America viewed crime and violence. In the post-war years, crime reporting was often sanitized or couched in moral lessons. By the 1970s and beyond, however, a grittier, more unflinching approach took hold. The Black Dahlia murder fit perfectly within this evolution. Its graphic nature, combined with its enduring mystery, made it a subject that both horrified and fascinated readers. The violence was undeniable, yet the lack of resolution made it strangely open-ended. A canvas on which society projected its fears, desires, and questions about justice. Perhaps the most dramatic resurgence of interest came in the early 2000s, when Steve Hodel published his explosive claims about his father, George Hodel. Drawing from old police files, personal family history, and circumstantial evidence, Steve argued that his father was not only capable of the crime, but had been a prime suspect at the time, quietly dismissed because of his wealth and influence. His book suggested that George Hodel's connections to art circles, his medical expertise, and his disturbing personal history aligned too closely with the murder to ignore. While many dismissed Steve's conclusions as speculative, others found them compelling, pointing out that his investigation revealed how the case may have been mishandled or suppressed. Even without definitive proof, the theory reignited public discussion and solidified George Hodel as one of the most infamous names attached to the Black Dahlia mystery. The resurfacing of the case through Steve Hodel's books also highlighted how the Black Dahlia had become more than a historical footnote. It was an active cultural phenomenon, capable of drawing headlines more than half a century after the fact. Documentaries, podcasts, and television programs began revisiting the case with renewed vigor, weaving together archival footage, interviews, and dramatic reconstructions. Each production presented itself as a fresh attempt to solve the mystery, but in truth, the power of the story lay less in the possibility of resolution and more in the enduring aura of the unknown. The Black Dahlia murder also became a lens through which scholars and cultural critics examined issues of gender, power, and media. Elizabeth Short's treatment in the press was dissected as an example of how victims, especially women, were often blamed or sensationalized. The way she was portrayed as promiscuous, mysterious, or reckless said less about her reality and more about societal anxieties toward women who lived outside traditional roles. The murder became not just a story of violence but a reflection of how mid-century America viewed femininity, ambition, and morality. In this way, Elizabeth's legacy extended beyond the crime itself. She became a case study in the intersection of misogyny and media exploitation. The cultural afterlife of the Black Dahlia extended deeply into art and literature. Novelists drew inspiration from the case, weaving fictionalized versions into noir thrillers and detective tales. James Ellroy's celebrated novel The Black Dahlia reframed the story as part of a larger meditation on obsession and corruption, later adapted into a Hollywood film. Painters and visual artists incorporated imagery from the crime scene into their work, using it as a symbol of fractured beauty and violence. Musicians, too, referenced the case, turning the name Black Dahlia into a shorthand for something both beautiful and tragic. Through these creative reinterpretations, Elizabeth Short's story was continually reshaped, each time reinforcing her place in cultural memory. Yet amid this cultural appropriation, the central truth remained. A young woman had been brutally murdered, and her killer was never brought to justice. For Elizabeth's surviving family, the spectacle surrounding her death was a source of lasting pain. They lived with the knowledge that her identity had been overtaken by the nickname and the myth, leaving little space for the real person she had been. This tension between Elizabeth Short, the woman, and the Black Dahlia, the symbol, remains one of the most haunting aspects of the case. By the time the 21st century arrived, the Black Dahlia murder had become a permanent fixture in the pantheon of unsolved American crimes, standing alongside cases like Jack the Ripper or the Zodiac Killer. Each represents not only a violent act but a failure of resolution, a reminder of the limits of justice. In Elizabeth's case, the continuing fascination lies in how the details of her death resonate with larger themes. The lure of Hollywood, the corruption of institutions, the power of the media, and the vulnerability of individuals caught in the web of both ambition and exploitation.